I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido. Welcome to another episode of KRAD COVID Readings, where I read my writings in order to cure the coronavirus blues. We are here with part 3 of Down to the Waterline, A Tale of Cassie Zukav, Weirdness Magnet. Before we start, I would like to once again plead to people to support my Patreon. There's lots of cool stuff on it. The most money you can spend on it is $20 a month, and that's it to get everything. And you can spend as little as $1 a month, and you get a monthly TV review. You can also get cat pictures, regular TV reviews, anywhere between 1 and 5 per month, monthly vignettes featuring my original characters, weekly excerpts of my works in progress, lots and lots of cat pictures. We have 2 incredibly cute cats named Kaylee and Louie, and their pictures are adorable. And at the $20 tier, you also get first looks at my first drafts. In particular, I want to mention the $10 tier. At $10, you get, like I said, the monthly movie review, the cat pictures, TV reviews, excerpts from my works in progress, and a monthly vignette featuring my original characters. I've already written about, 8 or 9 Cassie stories. So if you enjoy the Tales of Cassie Zukav Weirdness Magnet, there's also little vignettes featuring her, and also featuring the characters from Dragon Precinct, from Super City Cops, Shirley Holmes and Jack Watson, and also Brown Gold. So please consider supporting it. Patreon.com/crad. Anyway, here is the concluding part of Down to the Waterline, A Tale of Cassie Zukav Weirdness Magnet. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again, closed it again. Excuse me? Bottroff smirked. You do recall that I am deceased, yes? Very funny. But you never did tell me how you became deceased. I just figured you died alone in your sleep in the big house here. Would that it were so. He sighed. You wouldn't think a ghost could sigh, but there it was. It was after my wife passed on. Children were grown and had lives of their own. I had been considering retirement, but when Esmeralda grew ill, I continued to captain my vessel, rescuing boats from reefs and taking a percentage of their cargo as bounty in order to pay for her medicine. When the consumption at last claimed her, still I did not retire, for I truly had no other purpose in life. One afternoon, we rescued a fishing boat. Most of the passengers were men, but there was one girl aboard named Geraldine. I never did ascertain her family name, but I took a shine to her, and she to me. By that time, it had been almost a decade since I buried Esmeralda, and I'd not known the love of a good woman, or even a bad one, in all that time. I found Geraldine's affections to be, he sighed again, intoxicating. We saw quite a bit of each other. At the same time as our courtship, 2 bodies were found underneath the water. Men who had been stripped of all clothing and found drowned. It baffled the populace of the island. Then 1 week after the second death, Geraldine asked me to walk along the beach. To this day, I could not tell you why I agreed, nor why I also agreed to swim without a bathing suit. I couldn't help but chuckle. You went skinny dipping? The third sigh was shorter and nastier. I believe that is the vulgarism your generation has coined. Way predates my generation, but whatever. What happened once you got into the water? Somehow, I was able to continue to breathe, and Geraldine and I made love. I had not intended to do so outside the marriage bed, but I was caught in the moment. But then, he hesitated. When our lovemaking ceased, she swam away, and I could no longer draw breath. I've haunted my home ever since. He looked away from me with a faraway look that reminded me way too much of the way Jerry looked out at the ocean on dives. Geraldine disappeared from the island after that, and there were no more suspicious deaths until the turn of the century, the 20th century, I should say. Again, 3 men were found bereft of clothing under the sea within the span of a week between their deaths. And I saw Geraldine again walking down the thoroughfare. It had been more than 20 years, but she had not aged a day. I heard of others in the ensuing years, including once not long after the so-called Labor Day hurricane, and another only a decade ago, though I never again saw her. In each instance, the same events transpired. He stared right at me. I believe that Geraldine was a Nixie. I frowned. If I remember my Grimm's fairy tales from Professor Kochev's folklore seminar, Nixies are underwater sprites. One promised a destitute miller wealth and prosperity, but he'd have to give over his firstborn. When the kid was all grown up and married, the Nixie took him. The kid's wife tried to get him back and eventually succeeded, but it took decades. Stories of Nixies are contradictory, and the brothers who composed the fairy tales you cite only chronicled some of the legends. But if your Geraldine didn't age, she could very easily be Seymour's Jerry. Great. I gotta talk to the brother. I beg your pardon? I'll tell you later. I said as I pulled on a pair of shorts, slid into my flip-flops, and ran out the door. Now that I had a plan of action, I wasn't about to give it up, and I couldn't just sit around and wait for Rance to call me back. Given how he and Jerry were acting in Mayor Fred's, he might well have been the next target. It had been a week since Seymour died, who died a week after Zeke did. The Nix residence was a modest, one-story, white-shingled house a few blocks up from the lighthouse and the Hemingway house on Whitehead. There wasn't a doorbell, so I knocked on the wooden front door, the window of which was covered by a white lace curtain. Theo shoved the curtain aside and peered out. "What do you want?" "Let me in, Theo. We need to talk about your sister and Seymour and Nixie's." Alright, it was kind of a dorky thing to say, but Seymour did ask me to ask Jerry's brother about Nixie's. It was kind of his dying wish. To my amazement, Theo's eyes went wide. "Oh, fuck." Then he opened the door. "What do you know about Nixie's?" "Just what I read in Grimm," I said, putting on the know-it-all voice I used when I was a teaching assistant back in La Jolla. Combined with my height, it never failed to intimidate the undergrads. And since I had 8 inches on Theo, I made sure to loom. "But there's obviously more, and you're going to tell me what it is." Theo held up his hands and backed off. "Easy there. I don't want any trouble." "Then talk." "Alright, look. Old Jake and Willie knew their shit, except they left out the sex." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "That's the big thing with us, the sex." I blinked again. This was getting to be too much for one night. "Hang on, us?" "Yeah, what, you think we're just women? How the hell do you think we make more Nixies if we're all female?" To be honest, I hadn't given it that much thought. In fact, I hadn't given any of this any thought. "Of course," he went on, "Jerry's got a thing for doing it with humans underwater. Problem is, there's this whole breathing thing that gets in the way, so the guy always dies. It's a pain in the ass, let me tell you. Don't worry, though, she only needs to fuck 3 times every few decades or so. It's how we stay immortal." "Where is she now?" "How the fuck should I know? Trying to find her next victim, probably." Rance. Shit. I turned and ran up Whitehead toward Green. I needed to find them, and find them now. Somehow. I could do this. I communed with ghosts. I stopped a dragon and a sea monster. I could totally rescue a trained federal agent from a supernatural creature that had murdered 2 of my friends. All I had to do was figure out where she'd take him underwater. On an island full of beaches and piers. Piece of cake! When I got to Mayor Fred's, I didn't see either of them. It was too early for 1812 to have started, as the sun had only set an hour and a half ago. I grabbed Gina. "Hey, you seen Rance or Jerry?" "Yeah, they were in here for a while. She was putting the moves on your other half again. First she pulled that shit on Zeke 2 weeks ago, and then this. The girl's a skank, you ask me. You do not know the half of it. Where'd they go?" "Well, they said they were going to the pier, even though sunset was a while ago." "Thanks, Gina," I said quickly as I ran out. Then I stopped. They were going underwater, if they weren't there already. She could probably breathe underwater, but he couldn't, and neither could I. At least not without equipment. I ran back to the Bottroff house, nearly knocking down several teenagers on the Duval Street sidewalk. I generally left my gear in the truck, which saved me several minutes, as all I had to do was hop in the truck and pull out. I was even still wearing my bathing suit. Thank God it wasn't Saturday night, as the traffic would have been miserable. Even so, Key West was really for pedestrians once the sun set, so it took forever to get to the pier parking lot without actually running anyone over. I had 1,500 psi of air in the tank. That's about half full, which would probably do me for an hour or so. I didn't have time to go to C-Clips to fill it all the way. Hell, I had no idea how much time I had, but I had to at least check. For all I knew, it was too late, and just because they went to the pier didn't mean I knew where they went in the water, or where in the water they went, and URGH! To say I got funny looks from the few people left on the pier as I put my gear on would be understating the case. But nobody actually tried to stop me or get in my way. Eccentric behavior was normal in Key West, after all. I hadn't bothered putting on my wetsuit, just the regulator, mask, and tank. The water temperature was under 70, so the locals would probably think I was crazy for diving without at least a wetsuit, but they're all a bunch of weenies. They wouldn't last 2 seconds in the 50-degree temps in the Pacific that I cut my diving teeth on. I also attached the sheath with my dive knife to my ankle. I had a feeling I was going to need some kind of a weapon before the night was out. "Shit, at least you got some brains," someone said. I turned to see a balding guy who hadn't bathed any time this decade, wearing a ripped t-shirt and shorts with a silver beard that obscured his face. "Excuse me?" I said, regulator hanging below my jaw. "Other 2 that jumped in didn't have nothing." Jackpot. What other 2? "This guy in an ugly suit and some short chick in a leather mini. They was kissing and shit, and then they took their clothes off and jump in." He pointed at the far end of the pier. "Hey, lady, you got any money for beer?" I ran to the end of the pier without answering, but promised myself that if I came back alive, I'd get him a case. Sure enough, there were a pile of clothes, along with a shoulder holster and gun. The wallet and the pants had Rance's badge. Jerry was probably planning to ditch the clothes and leave him to be found nude like she did Zeke and Seymour. I considered taking the gun with me, then decided against it. I didn't even know how to take the safety off, and what the hell good would it do me underwater? Besides, I had the knife. I dove in. Normally, diving is like being covered in the world's biggest flannel blanket in zero gravity. Tonight, thanks to the lack of a wetsuit and the choppy current, it was more like having ice water dumped all over you. I tried very hard not to think about how unutterably stupid this whole thing was. I also tried not to think about the fact that it had taken 4 months for Rance to even make an oblique comment about my appearance, but it took Jerry less than 3 days to get him to jump naked into the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, she obviously had some kind of hypnotic hoozadingances. I mean, that had to be it. Why else would Rance have been so non-talkative last night? Why else would Captain Bottroff, who still couldn't handle me in my underwear after 6 months, have gone skinny dipping with a woman who'd only known for a few days? The current was even more brutal than expected, and I was reminded why I wasn't running a night dive right now. Swimming around took twice as much effort as it should have. I had been down for almost half an hour when I found them, which was damn good timing. Between running all over the island and swimming in the nasty current, I was exhausted and breathing very hard. The air supply, which normally would have lasted over an hour, was running out. But there they were, completely naked, doing the deed. Well, Jerry was, anyhow. She was gyrating to beat the band, water bubbles shooting out of her mouth like machine gun fire. Rance, though, didn't seem to be doing much of anything, including breathing. Fighting down a wave of nausea, I hit the catch on my knife holster, grabbed it in my right hand, and then swam right at them. Jerry was so engrossed in giving new meaning to leaving a wet spot that she didn't hear me coming. In fact, as I got closer, I could actually hear her screaming in a full orgasmic frenzy. The water muffled it, but it was definitely audible. I had to admit to being impressed if Rance could manage that while drowning. Just as she stopped screaming and said, "Whoo!" I reached out and slashed her in the arm with a knife. She bled green. That kind of threw me for a loop. So did the knife slash, the momentum from which had me tumbling in the water. "Bitch!" she cried and took a swing at me, and she didn't tumble. Her fist hit my bare right shoulder and hurt like a son of a bitch. Then she grabbed her arm where I'd stabbed her. The blood was pooling around her, making the water a very strange turquoise color. Turning, she kicked at me, her foot slamming into my stomach, forcing me to inhale a deep breath that I really couldn't afford to swipe from my diminishing air tank. I tried to get my bearings, but it turned out that she had used the kick to start swimming away. I guess she needed to stop the bleeding. Besides, it was kind of obvious that she was done with Rance. For his part, Rance started drifting toward the surface. I wasted about half a second trying to figure out who to go after, but it wasn't really much of a choice. I didn't have that much air left, even armed as I was. And even armed, I was kind of getting my ass kicked anyhow, and chances were Rance was drowning. Or drowned, since he wasn't flailing, just floating upward. My regulator had an octopus, a second mouthpiece with its own hose, meant for emergencies just like this. Well, okay, not just like this. But I swam up to where Rance was floating and put the octopus in his mouth. Then I kept going upward, hugging Rance close, hoping there was enough air to get us to the surface. We resurfaced at the pier. It was now 2 hours after sunset, and there was nobody in sight. I removed the octopus from his mouth and somehow managed to roll him up onto the wooden surface. I clambered up after him to see that he still wasn't breathing. Damn it. Ripping off my mask, I started to resuscitate him. Dimly, I noticed that after a few minutes we were starting to attract a small crowd, including my beer-loving friend. This wasn't too surprising. I mean, women in bathing suits and scuba gear giving CPR to naked men on a darkened pier wasn't exactly a commonplace occurrence. Not even on Key West. My arms felt like wet spaghetti even before I started doing compressions, and my right shoulder had a massive shooting pain every time I moved that kept getting worse and worse. Somebody had yelled out to call for an ambulance. Might have even been me, but who knew when they'd get here? I focused on Rance's hairy, wet chest, pumping his heart, and then giving him mouth-to-mouth. His mouth tasted like salt. Actually, it tasted like a margarita with salt. I hated margaritas. Just when I thought I would collapse, he coughed up water and started breathing. The crowd cheered. I let out a long breath. Rance's eyes flickered open. He whispered, "Jerry?" Somehow, I managed not to punch him. Of all the news stories that chronicled the event, my favorite headline had to be "Diver Saves FBI Nudist." It was also fun to see how many different ways the various papers and websites misspelled Demetrigian. I didn't see Rance much for the next week. He was back at his office and then up in Washington as they investigated the whole shebang. Jerry and Theo had both disappeared. I gave statements to both the feds and the local cops, but I left out the part about the Nix siblings being Nixie siblings. My email was part of the evidence, but when asked, I chalked the Nixie line up to typical diver eccentricities, which the law was more than happy to buy. Things settled down to something approaching normal. Kara and Andy hired a new dive master. I had my 15 minutes of fame while assorted news folks interviewed me and asked me about 100 variations on the same stupid question. What was going through your mind when you rescued Agent Demitas? And Captain Bottroff actually was nice to me for most of the day. But most people here treated it with the same, yeah, whatever, can I have another beer attitude that they treated everything else. The only thing that really caused comment was the fact that I actually used my dive knife. In all my years of diving, that was the first time I'd ever wielded the thing. Most divers never even unsheathed it, except maybe to get a can open. Once the news crews went away, I was back to being Cassie Zukav, part-time dive instructor, part-time help at the Bottroff house, underwater photographer, and regular at Mayor Fred's. Including Friday night, where, sure enough, Rance showed up. So, you still got a job, or did they clip your FBI cufflinks for flirting with a suspect? Rance smiled his small yet adorable smile. Nah, I still have a job. Actually, I got reprimanded, but that was it. Turns out Jerry put something in my drink to make me susceptible. Well, color me disappointed. Here I was expecting fancy schmancy hypnotic powers from a strange mythical creature. And all I got was a sex-starved immortal bimbo with access to good drugs. But I was grateful, too. At least my instincts about Rance's behavior were right. He continued, that's actually why I was acting so weird last week. And I'm really sorry about that, Cass. The acting weird part. I mean, believe me, I wouldn't have treated you like that normally. In any case, every law enforcement agency in the country is looking for her and her brother. I sipped my beer. Somehow I had a feeling that the Nixes weren't going to be found. I'd gone to the local library and looked up some Nixie legends, and one thing they all had in common. No one ever stopped the Nixies, or defeated them, or killed them. The best anyone could do was take their prize away from them. And hey, anytime you can do as well as a grim fairy tale hero or heroine, you're doing pretty damn good. Rance started to say something, then 1812 came back out and started their set with an old Dire Straits song off their first album called Down to the Waterline. Gina brought over Rance's beer. Just as the band finished the lengthy intro to the song, I held up my beer. Two men who can give a Nixie an orgasm underwater. It wasn't every day I could surprise Rance, but I figured I managed it this time. He snarfed his beer all over the table. The end. That story can be found on buzzymag.com. That's where I sold it. It's free. And it will eventually be reprinted in my next collection of Cassie Zukav stories. The first collection is called Ragnarok and Roll, Tales of Cassie Zukav, Weirdness Magnet. It came out in 2013 from Plus One Press. I have one more story to write, which I supported via Indiegogo. And if you go to igg.me/@/Gorvangin, Gorvangin, you can still support that story and get it when I write it. There's two stories there. The Gorvangin Rampages, which is a Dragon Precinct story, and another Cassie story, which I haven't written yet, but I will, called Ragnarok and a Hard Place. And it's going to be the concluding volume of the second collection, which will also be called Ragnarok and a Hard Place. So you may want to check that out. And then once I've written that story, Plus One will be doing a second collection, which will include Down to the Waterline, as well as some of the other stories I've read in this reading series. William Did It will be in there. Behind the Wheel, 7 Mile Race, not God of Blunder, that was already printed, but a bunch of others. I may write an original story for the collection. We'll see what the word count is. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please check me out online at DeCandido.net. Read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com. And as I said at the top of the episode, if you could check out my Patreon and try to support me there. Patreon.com/KRAD. Among other things, there's lots and lots of vignettes featuring Cassie and the gang. So, thanks very much. I will see you next week, and please stay safe.